Today's lecture will be divided into two parts. In the first part, we will discuss the role of political parties and pressure groups in the third world countries. And in the second part, we will discuss the role of new social movements in third world countries. Now, before I move ahead with my lecture, firstly, I am referring to countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America who gained independence after the end of the Second World War as third world countries. Of course, this definition is highly simplistic because third world countries is a term which is loosely applied to most of these newly independent countries, and they also have certain common features like economic backwardness, political instability, and a very backward rate of human development. Now, these third world countries, as I just mentioned, underwent a long process of colonial exploitation prior to becoming decolonized at the end of the Second World War. Now, most of these countries also experienced a considerable period of nationalistic struggle for freedom. And while it is true that political imperatives of the Second World War, the consequences of the Second World War were definitely instrumental in freeing these countries, we cannot ignore the fact that these countries did make a conscious effort overall to free themselves from the colonial exploitation imposed upon them by the developed or industrialized countries of Western Europe. Now, throughout this entire process of nationalistic struggle, it is but obvious that there must have been considerations as to the ideal form of government that these countries would like to adopt once they became independent from colonial rule. Now, as soon as these countries were freed from colonial exploitation, most of these countries, if not all, chose democracy as their favored kind of government or type of government. Now, democracy, as we know, or as is most commonly defined, is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, in order to make a government of the people and by the people, it therefore becomes imperative that elections are conducted. Because elections are those channels through which people end up electing their representatives who are going to rule on behalf of the people. Elections definitely presuppose the existence of political parties, which brings us to our present topic today. Now, political parties are basically such organizations which are formed by a substantially large group of people who have a same or very similar political ideology around which they have congregated or come together. Now, the work of political parties is basically to, spread their political ideologies. They are hierarchically organized, and they have definite media, they have financial support, they have a financial base, and they try to gain maximum amount of membership or support from the masses, firstly by trying to spread their particular ideologies. Now, once they garner support from the people, the next step is they want to recruit more and more members. In the process, they are actually disseminating or spreading their ideas regarding politics and, secondarily, maybe economy, culture, nationalism, anything and everything under the sun which is happening to the people in a country at a particular point of time will fall within the ambit of discussion, publicity, and propaganda by the political parties. Now, while the political parties are looking to recruit more and more members, they are also responsible for creating political consciousness amongst people. Now, when I say people, I mean such ordinary people who have no specialized or technical knowledge regarding the formation of government or the exact political or economic or diplomatic consequences of a particular step taken by the government. right? These are absolutely laymen or laywomen who, without having any specialized knowledge, get to understand the crux of a particular decision, policy, or law made by the government because there is a channel of communication. The party which I support, or the party of which I am a member directly, or the party to which I contribute maybe annually, that party basically helps me to form my opinion, my individual opinion regarding the actions or inactions of the government. Now, my party also helps me to evaluate, not just to understand what the government has done, but also it helps me to evaluate the government's doing. As in, when a particular policy or a particular law is formulated by the government, the political party to which I'm aligned or inclined, it helps me to understand whether this particular law or policy helps me or hinders me. And therefore, it actually helps to articulate my interest. Definitely, if a particular step taken by government is in my favor, my interest articulation becomes more positively oriented towards the government, and vice versa. Also, there might be many people spread across the length and breadth of my country who share interests which are similar to mine. But because of spatial and temporal factors, I might not come in contact with them, right? So political parties also perform the very important function of interest aggregation. Now, they are basically the linkages between government and ordinary people. They are also the organizations which provide candidates to the people. Like before any election, the ordinary people know who to vote for because of the publicity and the election campaigneering done by the political parties, right? Thus, we see that political parties are extremely essential for the proper working of a democracy, because without political parties, there would be no candidates, and without candidates, we would not be able to choose our representatives. That is how essential political parties are for the working of any democracy. Now, besides political parties, another kind of groups that are found in democracies are known as interest groups and pressure groups. Now, these words can be used interchangeably. They are more or less the same in their formation and in their functions. Now, when I say interest groups, I'm referring to basically a non-governmental group of people who have come together in order to protect and promote the interest of a particular group. An interest group might be actually a group protecting the interest of the manufacturers in a country, the industrial manufacturers in a country, or they might be a group protecting the interest of farmers, or maybe a group protecting the interest of homosexuals, or maybe a particular group which is trying to protect the interest and reinstate the economic rights of sex workers. Anything and everything which finds consonance or resonance with the ordinary people. Any such interest which is not being directly catered to by the government at large, the mainstream state apparatus, comes within the purview of interest groups. Now, like I mentioned, interest groups are non-governmental in nature, right? They do not contest elections. They do not want to form the government. While political parties, in case of political parties, the main motive is that they are going to enter the electoral competition process, and whoever wins the election will form the government. So the main aim of political parties is to form government. On the other hand, the main aim of interest groups is to remain outside the government and to pressurize the government so as to, make the government formulate such laws and policies which will be in the interest of the particular group which is represented by the interest group or the pressure group. It is believed that besides political parties, interest groups and pressure groups are very, very essential in order to enrich the working of a democracy. because simply establishing a country or proclaiming a country to be democratic or conducting elections at periodic intervals does not guarantee that a country is truly democratic. If we want to ensure that a country is qualitatively a good democracy, then definitely there should be a very healthy, open civil society which helps people to come forward and on a spontaneous basis participate in the running of the country. And I don't only mean politics, but every aspect of the country where people find it easy to participate, where the system, the civil society is open, constructive, spontaneous, and active, and action-oriented. Automatically, a democracy can thrive only under such conditions. Now, if you've listened to my discussion thus far carefully, and if you try to search for those conditions in the third world countries, you don't need to be an expert in order to realize that most of these conditions are not found in third world countries. This is because these third world countries have been categorized recently as electoral democracies instead of liberal democracies. Periodic elections also happen in these countries. Yet we find that democracy here is a structure which has been imposed from above externally. It is not a form of government which has grown up in the third world countries in response to the social, economic, and political evolution of that particular country or that particular society. Therefore, unfortunately, democracy remains more in name. Because while elections do happen in a scattered and irregular manner, and while civil liberties or political rights, social rights do exist, but they are not as real or as qualitatively rich and unqualified as they are in the liberal democracies of the West. Right? It is more of a superficial structure that has been imposed or that has been copied from the so-called West, and something which has not yet grown proper roots in the soils of the third world countries. Because in third world countries, politics is still not a secular activity. It is still the parochial identities of man like language, religion, caste, region, gender, which manages to dominate politics. Rather, politics is not just dominated, it is in fact conducted on the basis of these parochial identities. Therefore, there is no separation of the social and personal sphere from the political sphere in the third world countries. So the first most important and essential prerequisite for a democracy is done away with in third world countries. Secondly, political parties in a democracy are supposed to be all about concrete ideologies, concrete political ideologies and concrete developmental programs. The more parties that exist in a democracy, the more choice people in a democracy are supposed to have, right? But in third world countries, we find that political parties are mostly created based around particular personalities, particular leaders. Okay, there are cults that develop around a particular family or maybe a particular individual. His or her ideas manage to thrive and to drive the politics of that particular party, as well as if that party manages to win power, then the politics of the country as well. But very often we find that with the demise of that particular leader, the party might fall apart. It might, there might be squabbles within the party, or the party might altogether cease to exist. Thus, in the minds of the people also, they are not very conscious or inquisitive as to what a particular political party represents or what the particular manifesto of a particular party contains. Okay, they are more interested in who the leader of that particular party is and what he or she believes or what he or she represents to them. Right? Therefore, the kind of leadership that we come across in third world countries is what Max Weber would call charismatic leadership, okay, a sort of cult worship, and not impersonal, policy-driven or program-driven political activity by political parties and political leadership. This is yet another difference and a very big drawback as far as the working of democracy and political parties in third world countries are concerned, right? Next, opposition in traditional Western democracies, opposition is considered to be of very huge importance and impact in a democracy, because we know that after coming to power, every government will actually try to reinstate its own ideology and its own interests, basically. Now, therein, it is very important for a particular opposition to exist so as to ensure that the party in power does not trample over the interests of the ordinary people. Right? Therefore, an opposition plays a very, very important role. In fact, it completes the circle of a democracy. Whereas in third world countries, which even those countries which call themselves democracies, we find that opposition parties are looked at in a very negative light. Okay, almost always the governments in third world countries will look upon opposition parties as obstructionist in nature. Okay, as if the only reason for the existence of the opposition parties is to oppose whatever the party in power does. Okay, which is not basically the case. The opposition party is there to ensure that ordinary people, A, become aware of the acts of omission and commission of the government, also to constantly keep the pressure alive on the government that it has made certain promises to the electorate on the basis of which it has been elected to power. And lastly, the opposition is also present to ensure that in case the government somehow falls apart, it is there to take the place of the government and therefore to avoid political vacuum, right? Now, despite this very constructive role of the opposition in a democracy, third world countries do not give due credit to opposition parties. Therefore, the quality of democracy that functions in third world countries has deteriorated. It has become very poor in nature, right? Next, we find that in third world countries, the divide between the rural areas and the urban areas is too huge. The gap between the rural and the urban areas in terms of the level of economic development or in terms of social economic infrastructure available or in terms of accessibility to the various important needs of life, the various services that make our life comfortable, that is very huge, the difference in the rural and the urban areas. Now, mostly in the third world countries, we find that the government spends more time pushing forward areas which are already better off than the rest. Okay, this politics has been very true in many of the third world countries, perhaps in even the largest democracies in the world. We've found that this is one of the major reasons for regional imbalances in development. Now, with this attitude of the government to concentrate more on urban areas, the rural areas, the people living in the rural areas are becoming more and more marginalized. Now, this marginalization is once again leading to deprivation, exploitation, and creating dissatisfaction in the minds of people in the rural areas. Now, with dissatisfaction, this dissatisfaction is captured by certain asocial or antisocial elements or groups in society. Criminal gangs thrive in such areas. Terrorist activities become very common in such areas. And also, basically, anti-state mentality starts to develop in the rural areas because of the lack of proper distribution of all the facilities, goods, services that are being generated by the state. Also, we find that whether bureaucracy or the army in the third world countries are not directly under democratic control. Now, of course, these are sensitive areas of the state apparatus and therefore should not be directly manipulated by the public, but a certain amount of accountability to the people, to the common people at large, should be ensured so as to guarantee that these particular apparatus are working in tandem with the ultimate objective of general welfare, popular welfare and development at the level of the masses. Now, besides these drawbacks that are found in the political parties in third world countries, we find there is a definite lack of interest groups and pressure groups also. We know that whether in America or in France, a certain variety of pressure groups and interest groups are actually dominating, most so in USA, dominating the politics of that particular country. Definite interests are being represented by groups which even go to the extent of using lobbyists, that is paying somebody to lobby for a particular cause in legislative committees or in the legislative house. Okay. Now, in third world countries, we find that, of course, there are interest groups and pressure groups, but the amount of activity or the amount of power or the amount of interest, influence that they hold over the government is considerably less in comparison to the working of interest groups and pressure groups in first world and second world countries. Also, since many of the third world countries are just cosmetically speaking democratic, but at soul mainly authoritarian in nature, it is impossible for pressure groups or interest groups to flourish in those countries. Mostly, these third world countries, though they call themselves democratic, survive on one-party systems, and therein also that particular party claims to be able to look after the interests of all possible groups of people living within that country. They are not accommodative of separate organizations or non-governmental organizations which can or which should be present in order to represent the diverse interests present in a society. Therefore, both political parties and pressure groups, which are actually the very basis of enriching democracy qualitatively, are definitely not performing the functions that they should in third world countries. Because of these factors that I have just discussed, it becomes evident that democracies in the third world countries are actually qualitatively very poor. Therefore, the roles performed by or the functions performed by the political parties and the pressure groups are neither qualitatively high nor functionally diverse, nor are they actually successful towards achieving the ends for which they had been created in the first place. This is the precise reason why these democracies are being termed as electoral democracies or sometimes even frozen democracies. Countries which call themselves democracies but actually are not willing enough to make the entire range or gamut of reforms that are required in order to bring them at par with the advanced democracies of the world. Thus, these democratic forms of government in the third world countries often end up creating soft states or weak states or hybrid states.